Dr. Alex McFarland, Bert Harper with you today, going through the book of James. Right before the break, Alex, I mentioned that James, who is, and we talked about this yesterday, in my mind is no doubt the half-brother of Jesus. And that now we know for sure that they weren't followers of Jesus until after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and then they became followers of Christ. But the possibility of it seemingly them being close by when Jesus taught was a reality, because 2 or 3 times in the Gospels you'll have them saying some things about Jesus and they were close by. I happen to believe that James may have been present at the Sermon on the Mount. Some of the commentators that I went through was comparing the book of James, as I said yesterday, the Proverbs of the New Testament, but some more said it is the fulfillment and a kind of the Sermon on the Mount. And just one for an example, and there's about 6 or 7 of those that you can look at and compare it to the Sermon on the Mount, and we would not have time to do that on a radio program, although that would be a good sermon for a preacher to preach on a Sunday morning. But Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12 says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, going back to James 1:2 that we already covered, but I wanted to do this to show an example. Notice what he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Here, again, I see James paralleling the Sermon on the Mount, and it happens several times. So this, again, and I want to refer back to yesterday because we was talking about the credibility of the book of James. This even adds to the credibility of James and it being so valuable to the Christian in how to live a Christian life, because I think it parallels the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, especially 9 through 18 in James chapter 1 really sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read a little bit of this, and then I want to make a comment. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossom falls, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Now, this we've already had amazing statement number 1, count it all joy when you fall into trials. Now, here's amazing statement number 2. Believers in humble circumstances should take pride in their high position. So let me understand the vantage point of heaven, Pastor Bert. If I'm a lowly person of low means, that's a high position. But if I'm a wealthy person of great means, that's really a low position?
I'm telling you what, Jesus turns the world upside down, Alex. That's what he does. And you remember that phrase in the book of Acts when it says, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also"? You know, Jesus literally does turn the world upside down in its teaching and everything about it. And you've just read, I agree with you, amazing statement number 2. What a way to explain that, Alex.
Well, let me say this, and we've said it on the program many times. And listen, there's nothing necessarily pious about poverty, and there's nothing necessarily evil about riches. I mean, I know some wealthy folks that are some of the most godly people you'll ever meet, and I've met some indigent, poor people that were very ungodly. The point in this is that we recognize the transience of this world. The wealthy person, James says, look, is being humiliated, because the greatest glory of man is still going to fade away like an ocean wave destroying a sandcastle. But the lowly brother can rejoice in his exaltation, because the poor person, if he's living life with God, is realizing, hey, I'm trusting God for everything. what a privilege to know that my very next meal, if I get it, is only going to come about by the grace of God. I do think the poor person, and again, poverty is not necessarily piety, but I have met people in foreign countries that were absolutely in squalor, but they had the joy of the Lord because they were trusting God for their very days living. And then the wealthy person, it's pathetic. And I've been around some wealthy and I've been around some famous people that had no clue that with a single phone call, God could have taken it all away. I think what we've got to remember is this life is transient. Whatever we have by the goodness and grace of God. And if we want true riches, we invest in the things that are eternal, which are the things of God, such as Matthew 6:33 talks about.
Well said. And I would say this, that's the reason Jesus in his model prayer says, give us this day our daily bread. Each and every one of us need to understand, no matter how much money you got in the bank, no matter what you're driving, no matter where you live, we are that one moment, that one phone call away from disaster in our lives where everything will change. So you need to live your life trusting in Jesus Christ and not in wealth, not in position, regardless of what your position may be, high or low. Now, verse 12, Alex, notice what he does. He takes us back. You know, this is what it makes me think of Proverbs, because in Proverbs you'll start going in one direction and it seems like he'll talk about something else, and then he'll take you back to the trials or he'll take you back to wisdom. And here in verse 12 it says, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Again, we're taking us back to trials, and it says, blessed is the man. That sounds like the Beatitudes a little bit, doesn't it? Blessed is the man who perseveres, and there's that word again, under trial. So we're talking about Jesus Christ really knowing that they have withstood the test. Now, I want to ask you this, Alex. You're always asking me questions. When Jesus gives a test, is it for our good or for our harm?
Oh, absolutely for our good. God doesn't tempt us to sin, and God doesn't try to entice us away from himself. He always does things for our good and his glory.
He really does. And listen to this, and we can talk about this, and it would, again, we're talking about a lot of Sunday morning sermons here in the book of James. It's filled with it. But it says this person who has stood and perseveres through the trial, he'll receive the crown of life that God promised to those who love him. There are at least 5 different crowns that's talked about in the Bible, and this is one of them, and it is persevering under trial. Alex, have you noticed there seems to be certain people that I've met in my life, it seems like their entire life is an extreme struggle. Now, life is a struggle. That's the way life is. But some people seem to be with severe struggle, and a lot of it is seemingly no fault of their own. It's just a life of struggle. I am here to tell you, if you're one of those people or you feel like that, and if you persevere in your faith, trust in Jesus Christ, counting it joy when you're falling under these difficult circumstances, there's a crown of life waiting upon you for those that love him and persevere through those struggles. God's going to reward us, and some of those rewards are not always down here, are they? They're waiting on us up there.
Well, that's true. That's true. And Bert, I don't know if you ever remember this poem, but I was a English major in college and studied a lot of poetry. And Langston Hughes was a great poet, and he wrote this poem called "Mother to Son," and it had this famous line: "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair." Do you remember that?
I do.
Life has
I'm
not
sorry
been a
to
crystal
laugh,
stair.
but isn't that so true, brother?
Yeah. It says it's had tacks in it, boards torn up, splinters, and long patches of floor with no carpet on them. And that's a really good analogy. And you're right. This life, there's trouble. But here's the thing. The Bible says, "Blessed be God the Father of all mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them who are in any trouble." And so James says, blessed is the man. And the word blessed means happy. And you might say, well, what I'm going through has not really made me happy. But you know what? If you can maintain God's perspective, I think retrospectively, you can not only see what God was doing in your life, but even praise God for the trial, because if nothing else, it deepened your testimony. You can come alongside somebody who's hurting and very legitimately say, hey, I understand. I was there. And let me tell you, God is faithful. Bert, I've seen cancer survivors that could really witness to fellow cancer strugglers. I've met people that had been unemployed and had to pray their way into their next job position, and they can come alongside and give encouragement and say, hey, I know what you're going through. I this morning was at a studio recording, and I was talking to a person whose spouse had walked out on them, and they said, you know what, it was the hardest season of my life, but I know how to minister to people who are going through that. And so happy is the person that processes their pain with heaven in view, because there's reward, there's intimacy with Christ. I mean, Bert, where else do you turn when Christ is all you've got left?
There's nowhere to turn, and I want to make three statements before we go through this. First of all, in verse 2, you consider it pure joy, or count it all joy. And then in verse 12, blessed is the man who perseveres through the trials. In order to have real happiness on the outside, Alex, you got to first have the joy on the inside. And that's what James does. James talks about the joy first and then the blessed or happiness second. The second thing is a lot of folks want first they want the crown without the cross. And here it says he's going to give a crown of life, you know. The only way those crowns come is through the suffering. And you're not going to get a crown without the suffering. And the third thing I'd want to say before we go into our break is that the suffering comes and then the glory. The greater the suffering, the greater the glory. And I believe that with all my heart. I believe if you're struggling down here and you've wondered why in the world this life has been so difficult, I believe there's great glory waiting upon you. How much more will you appreciate heaven when you get there? Alex, the suffering that we have here, according to Paul, says is nothing to compare with the glory that's waiting on us up there. Isn't that right, brother?
C.S. Lewis wrote about the weight of glory, W-E-I-G-H-T. There's also the weight, W-A-I-T, the weight on God. That's what we do, exploring the Word. We're going to be back after this brief break. Don't go away.
This is Holy Land Moments with Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, founder of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews.
Giving our best, whether at home, at work, or in whatever we do, is important to us all. But do we do the same for God? Do we give Him what the Bible calls the first fruits of our time and energy and devotion? The holiday of Shavuot, which was originally a harvest celebration, was a time to thank God for His abundant provision by bringing Him the